the date of this interview is June 10th, 1990. Mrs. Lowenstein, could you talk about what life was like in your town before the war?
Well, I was a little girl then, but it was very pleasant. It was a very Catholic town. And of course, Catholics were persecuted too by Nazis eventually. And we never felt very much persecuted until the Kristallnacht. Also, the fact that it was so close to the border, we were only about 4 or 5 miles from the Belgian border and from the Dutch border. And there were a lot of foreigners always coming through. I think that made life quite a bit easier for us too. Any holiday, Germans had big demonstrations or anything, we were never there. We would always go to Holland or Belgium. And
what kind of a home, what was your home like?
Well, we lived in a very nice apartment. Old apartment, belonged to my grandmother. The house belonged to my grandmother. It was an apartment house across from a church and across the street from a nunnery. And we were very friendly with the nuns. And we had a very large, beautiful synagogue. And
what about your school?
Went to Jewish school. There were 2 school rooms for 8 grades. But it's surprising how much we learned.
So about how many students?
Well, in each class, there were about 40 students in each class. And we were just separated in groups and, and when our teacher was busy with another group, then we had to study, you see. And we went like from 8 to 1, and we had recess in the middle of it when we played. And on our way home, I used to always come home late because we would stop and play on the street. And when I came home, I got a good thrashing for it. And the next day I would do the same thing again. I was sort of not very goody-goody.
And this was a Jewish school?
Uh-huh.
Why didn't you go to a public school?
Well, most everybody went to this school, like I said, for 4 years. In fact, my father went to the same school in 1906 when he started school at 6 years. He went for 4 years to the school. And the first couple of years, I had the same teachers he had. And he went there for the first 4 years, then he went to high school. And at 17 he was inducted in the war. That was 1918. He was very severely wounded in the war. He was only there for 2 months at the front. And then he spent 2 years in a hospital. And when they got married, my father was still walking on crutches, you see.
Gosh.
Yeah. And then he went to a school. Aachen was well known for its cloth manufacturing, and they had a very famous school there. He became a textile engineer, but after that he decided it was easier to work in sales, and he represented several factories and traveled. So, because that's one thing he could do, he could drive.
Now, how did the Nazis' rule in Germany first affect you?
Well, of course, after 4 years, I stayed in the school until we left Germany, rather than going to high school, because we knew some of the other kids that went to high school, they had to sit on separate benches or in the back of the room, being Jewish. And my parents decided that they didn't want to do that.
Now, how old were you about?
At that time, I was about 10, 11 years old, 10 years.
So high school started that young?
Yeah, It just went for for more years, actually. So then at 13, I was almost 14, we left for Peru in 1939, June 16th, 1939.
Well, what are some of the things that occurred that...
Well, of course, the Crystal Night. And at that time, my father always thought, you know, it can't last forever, it has to get better. But after the Crystal Night, he said, no, it's time to go. And of course, then we had a hard time getting out. His sister had emigrated to Peru 2 years earlier. And through her, we found out there was a consul in France who had given tourist visas to everybody who wanted one for a lot of money.
Where was this consul?
In France, in Paris.
In Paris.
So we got a visa from him, just a tourist visa. And we went to Hamburg to board the ship up. And the consul in Hamburg, who has to approve the visa when you go on, you know, board the ship, he would not approve it because he said, you know, so many people had bought this and they had found out about it, that it was not a legitimate visum.
So you could get the visa, but you couldn't get...
You couldn't get on the ship.
Out.
So the shipping company told us, if you get on the train here and go to France, this ship is going to also take on passengers in Cherbourg, which is a port on the French coast. The French consul has given this visa. He cannot deny it. He has to approve it because he gave it.
So is that what you did?
That's what we did.
So you went from Paris to...
No, we went from Hamburg to Paris. We had 3 days in Paris waiting for the ship to get to Cherbourg, and that's where we boarded the ship.
But I meant from the time you got the visa, then you got the visa
we got the visa
Paris,
already
then
before.
Hamburg, then back to France.
Yeah.
Back to Paris.
No, the visa was done by mail. You know, you didn't have to go.
Oh.
You see. So anyway, my brother lived already. He had gone after his bar mitzvah. He was sent to Liège, which is an hour's drive from Aachen in Belgium.
So he's older than you?
He's a year older, and he caught the ship in Antwerp. So he got on the ship a day before we did, actually.
This is the same ship?
Yeah, all the same ship. They went from Hamburg to Antwerp to Cherbourg and to England, and then across the ocean. And of course, in Peru, we did not know whether we would get off the boat.
How long did it take to get to Peru?
18 days. 18 days.
Do you remember anything about that?
Oh, it was a beautiful ship. Very luxurious. It was only its second voyage. And the food and everything was just marvelous. We had the best time.
And you had a cabin?
Yeah, for 4. Very, very lovely. And it was a fabulous, you know, we stopped, went through the canal and down the west coast, you know, it's just lovely. And my aunt and uncle, who had lived there already, they somehow got a permission from the government somehow, by paying a lot of money for it, for us to get off the boat. See? My mother tells this all, and it's much better than I do, because I was too little to remember a lot of the details. And anyway, we found an apartment, and we started living in Lima. I remember we went shopping, grocery shopping with a dictionary the first few days, and little by little we learned Spanish. And then I needed to go back to school, and I went to the Lima High School, which was an American missionary school. And instead of learning Spanish, which I did on the street, I learned English.
Now, why did you go to this American school?
It was really one of the best schools there was in Lima. And you could take, you got a complete high school education. Plus, you could take either academic or commercial courses, and I took commercial courses. And after I graduated, I started working in office as a secretary.
Did you have any problems adjusting to or learning the language or finding housing?
No, none whatsoever. We had a very lovely apartment, which my parents lived in there until after my father died. My mother moved to the United States. Until then, they lived there. My father died in 1953, and she moved here in 1956, I think. She moved to New York.
And what did your father do?
He did the same. Also selling textiles. It was hard during the war because you couldn't get any merchandise, see? But then after the war, business picked up. Of course, he didn't live long enough to enjoy it, which was,
It's too bad.
It's too bad.
Now, do you have any memories from Germany before you left?
Not too many.
About?
I remember on Sundays we used to take walks through the woods, you know.
But I mean...
you mean if anything happened?
I'm sorry, go ahead, keep going.
That affected me, like because of the Nazis?
Yes.
No, hardly any. Hardly any. I remember the Kristallnacht.
What do you remember about it?
I remember they came and got my dad. And my mother carried on like crazy, and she went along.
And you were...
And she went with him. No, my brother was already in Belgium then.
So you were alone?
I was there, yeah. And I don't know, for some reason I remember the house was like 5 stories high, and for some reason, I don't know why, I just went way up there and just stayed there. I didn't want to come down. You know?
And you were by yourself?
Yeah. And after a few hours, my mother and father came back. And my mother tells this so much better. But what happened was that she carried on that about him fighting in the war for the Germans and all that kind of stuff, you know, and almost losing his leg, and now they want to take him to a concentration camp. And so this one guy finally told her, you know, calm down. If whatever you say is true, he can go back, you know, with you. So she went with him, but she had to wait outside. And when he came out, what happened in there? He had to undress and show the guys all his wounds from the war. You know? And he was very lucky. Now, this happened several times. You know, when they invaded the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia, my uncle, who was the oldest in the family, he said to my father, listen, I'm going to cross. See, my uncle, 2 of my mother's siblings had already gone to Holland. And they had butcher shops in Holland, but right across the border. So it was a half-an-hour drive by car or less, you know, like from here to Franklin. And so he said to my father, let's go, let's have a card game over there with his brothers and so on and so forth. They played cards. Let's go over there this evening, play cards. And they went. But on the night of the Kristallnacht, when we found out what happened in France, which was just a pretext really, because you know this was all prepared ahead of time, he said, I'm going to visit Walter, which was his brother. And you want to come along? And my father said, no, I think nothing is going to happen. I'll stay home. Of course, my uncle went over, never came back. And my youngest uncle, the one that's gone with us now on this trip, he had gone already 2 years earlier to Holland. And that's also very interesting. He had a girlfriend who was not Jewish. You know, it was against the law. And one evening, one of his friends had a birthday. And some of this guy's friends from Aachen came to celebrate the birthday. And they said to him, you know, tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock we're going to go to the Keller's house and get Ernie Keller. And this friend, who was a very decent person, came over to his house and told him, Ernie, you better leave. That was like midnight. They're coming at 6 o'clock for you. So Ernie got into his car and went over to Holland. Oh. Never came back. See?
Incredible.
Yeah. So that's the fact that we lived so close to the border, you know.
So were there other families who went with you when you crossed
When we went
when
to
you
Peru?
went to Peru?
No.
There was-
Well, there was one friend of my father's who went also to Peru, but my aunt and uncle were there already, and they were there when we got there and helped us get established and helped us find the apartment. We had a very nice apartment, this two-story house, sort of like a duplex, and I started to go to school. It was very pleasant.
So you went to Peru because of this aunt and uncle?
Yeah, well, this was one place that we could find a visa to go to. At that point, we would have gone anywhere, but we preferred to go there. When we were on the train from Hamburg to Paris, there was a guy in our compartment, and he was a Jewish guy. And my parents started to talk to him, or vice versa, and he said, "Listen, why do you want to go all the way to Peru? I know Daladier, who was the premier of France at that time. I know him personally. I can get you a visa to stay in France." And my father said, "No way. If I go as far as I can get."
So how long? So you went to high school in Peru.
And I came back. I came to the States in 1946.
Now, why did you come to the United States?
Well, first of all, my uncle and aunt invited me, and I wanted to get away. I wanted to try my wings on my own a little bit.
So you were about 20 then?
Yeah. It was very funny. First time I went out, somebody asked me for a date. So I went to my aunt and uncle. I said, "May I go?" And they looked at me. "Sure, you can go if you want to. If you don't want to, you don't." And then I asked what time I had to be home.
Oh.
They said, "Well, if you have a good time, you can stay out. If not, you can come home soon."
So this was different than when you lived with your parents?
I had never gone out by myself on a date. And not only that, it was almost impossible during the war years to get a telephone. And if somebody asked me for a date, and my parents didn't know too many of the young people, and they were very, very protective, he would have to come to the house, ask my father, and then he would say, "Well, I'll think about it." And he would, when he went into town, he would find out who the guy was and what background and this and that and the other. And then when he came back, he would say either yay or nay.
It's very different now, isn't it?
Oh, even there it's different now. Oh, yeah.
Now, when you were in Peru, though, and going to school, did you feel like an outsider? Did you feel different?
Well, there was only one other Jewish girl in my class, and I had one experience. Of course, the Methodists tried very much to convert you, but they also tried that, of course, with the Catholic girls. And one Catholic girl asked me one day, "What are you, Methodist or whatever?" And I said, "I'm Jewish." She said, "What's that?" But they were all very friendly.
So you
had a lot of friends.
So you were able
But we stayed sort of with the Jewish community, We stuck to the Jewish community as far as making friends is concerned.
And how was the Jewish community there to people from Europe?
Well, of course, everybody else had come from someplace. And it just depends on where you found your friends, you would go. They had 3 communities there. There's the German community, the Sephardic, and the Ashkenazi, the Eastern European. And I was sort of in between, because most of the German Jews lived in Miraflores, which is outside of, it's like living in Brentwood or on Belmead, okay? And we lived sort of in between, so it was closer for me to go to the community center in fact, it was only about 4 blocks from the Sephardic community center and synagogue. And so it was much easier for me to go there. So I did not have many friends among the German Jewish community for some reason or other, even though they were basically much closer in background.
But people
most
were
of my
friendly
friends were the others.
And people, you didn't feel like an outsider then?
No.
So you came to New York
And
when
then
you were 20?
Mm-hmm. And
how
I
long
worked. I lived there until 53. When I actually, in between, I lived in San Francisco for a year. My girlfriend and I, we decided we were going to travel. And we accumulated our vacation to have 4 weeks vacation. And we flew to Los Angeles. And we didn't like it there, so we hopped on the train and went to San Francisco. And we were there one day and we decided, gee, this is nice here. So we called up our jobs, told them we're not coming back. Within 3 days, we both had jobs and an apartment. And then Anne's father got sick. And so we decided she needs to be there because she doesn't, she wasn't practically an only child. She has a sister who lives in Australia who could not help, you know. So she decided, and I didn't want to be there by myself either, without any relatives, you know. And I was not there long enough to really have close friends.
So you went back to New York?
Went back to New York, and then I met my husband, and we got married. And I came to Nashville.
Now the rest of your family, your uncles or other members
my mother
of your family?
was one of 6, okay? And my father had 2 sisters. My mother's brother is the one that brought me over to New York. He also, like I said before, he left from one day to the next. And the youngest brother stayed in Holland underground, hiding also his parents. Now, there were one more brother and one more sister in Holland, and they said, well, we're not going to need to go into hiding, we'll stay around. And they, of course, were deported and killed. And one aunt went to Israel in 1935, and she's still alive. She's 86 years old. And the oldest brother died in 1962 in New York, the one I lived with, and then the other one is still living in New York. He came to New York after the war, after he was liberated. Of my father's 2 sisters, one of course went to Peru 2 years before we did. And the other one, the youngest sister, who is 10 years younger, she's just 80 now, she was deported. She was in concentration camp. Her child was killed, 9 years old. She was raped in front of the child. And then eventually, one day she came home from where she had to work, and the child was gone. And her husband was deported, sent someplace else. She found out later that he survived liberation, but he was so sick he died about 2 weeks afterwards, before she ever found him. Well, she somehow escaped during an air raid and made her way to the Russians. And a Russian Jewish soldier helped her to get to the American side. He told her, you'll be better off this way. And then, of course, after the war, we found out she was alive. My father brought her to Peru. And she was about 38 at that time, 39. There she met somebody he was also from Germany. He had studied law but never practiced in Germany. And he was never very successful, though, in business. Anyway, he wanted to marry her, and she did, because she was, you know, at that age, she decided at least she's not by herself. And they had a child, still. And this man, since he was not able to make a good living in Lima, he was offered a job by the German government to work for the reparation department. You know, where they give back money.
Did he take it?
And he took it, and they went back to Germany. And at that time, the child was 15 years old, and working for the government, they had a free apartment. The education of the child was assured, was free. And he's only about 4 years older than my own child. And he has a very good job. He lives in Germany, and so does she. They never went back anywhere else because the husband died eventually, and he has a good job, and he says, even though I don't want to live in Germany, I don't want to transplant her again. She's 80 years old. He married an Israeli girl, and they have a 5-year-old child. And that's my first cousin, who is as old as my children. And my mother's youngest brother, who came after the war to the United States, he also married fairly late, because during the war they couldn't get married. And he has a daughter, in fact a very beautiful daughter, who lives in New York, who has triplets. She has 4 children altogether, one of them a set of triplets. And she also lives in New York. So those are all the siblings, you know, the cousins. And now, in my other aunt, the one that still lives in Peru, she had 2 boys, and one of them died in 1977. And the other one lives in Israel now. He had come to the United States to study on a scholarship. What was the guy's name? He was from Tennessee. Cordell Hull Scholarship. And went back to Peru. He became a geologist. Went back to Peru and worked for a year for the government, and then he worked for an American company. And when the Peruvian government took over the petroleum company, U.S. Petroleum Company, they appropriated it, you know. They wanted him to work for them, and he didn't want to. He had already, you know, been working for this American company for many years. So they made it a little bit uncomfortable for him, you know. And he decided he's going to leave with his family. He has 4 daughters, and they had a choice to continue working for the same company, either in America, in North America, or in Israel. So he chose Israel. He went to Israel with his 4 daughters. They're all married there now, and they have 8 grandchildren, and they're going to be at our reunion too. So that's the rest of the family.
So your family's very scattered still, isn't
Very
it?
scattered, extremely scattered. With some of the, my mother's first cousins went to Argentina, and she visited them yet, but I don't know whether any of them are coming.
Do you feel at home in the United States?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else but Nashville.
And how?
I have very, very good, close friends, and that's what counts.
Now, when did you get to Nashville?
53, when I married. And after, both my children live in Chicago. And after Henry died, everybody asked me, when are you going to move to Chicago? I said, no way.
Have you ever gone back to Europe?
Germany? Yeah, I went back twice. 4 years ago, I went back with my kids. And I showed them where I was born, where we grew up, where my grandparents lived, in a little village outside of Aachen, and which was interesting. And then last winter, we went back to celebrate my aunt's 80th birthday, and we also went to Aachen, and my grandfather, from my father's father, is buried there. And for the first time in our entire life, the all surviving cousins of this man, which are only 4, were at his graveside all together.
Oh.
So it was very emotional.
How did you feel about, did you meet anyone you knew?
No. I wasn't interested either.
Did you have any feelings about?
No, the first time I went back, it was almost like a strange place, as if I had never lived there. It was very peculiar. I had absolutely no special feeling for it. Now, in 1975, we went back to Peru for a visit. My husband never wanted to go, and when I had my 50th birthday, he said, what do you want for your birthday? I said, I want a trip to Peru. So we went. My cousin was still alive then, you know, a bunch of other family there. And when I went back to Peru, that was to me like coming home. I had a lot of, you know, sentimental feeling for there, but not for Germany. I guess I was not big enough, not old enough. I think, you know, the teen years are really the formative years. That's when you develop those kind of feelings.
do you feel that this whole experience has, you know, involved in leaving Germany and living in Peru before you came here? How do you feel it's affected your life?
Well, it definitely has. I'm sure that you can't tell how it would have turned out if these things hadn't happened.
But
Probably
I mean,
would have, in terms of
how you look at things or how you look at people. And
one thing that I've learned from my mother, I don't really cling to anything. I'm not a saver, you know. I've seen it destroyed, and you know, things don't have value. Your life has value, not things. That's the one thing that I've learned, and family is very important. I think it's really gives meaning to your life to have family and connections.
And
you miss those that are gone, and I mean, it's just a terrible thing to think about what happened to them. But life goes on, and there's nothing you can do about it. My nephew asked the same question in this tape at the end, you know, and he says, well, and my uncle answers very well. He says, you have to make your decisions from one day to the next. You shouldn't plan ahead, and you should take things as they come and then decide what you're going to do about it.
Has your experience affected the way you brought up your children?
No. I think the way I was brought up personally has affected the way I brought up my children. I think I've given them a lot more freedom. Now, I don't know whether that's because it's just customary here or because of the fact that I was brought up very strictly, you know. I think the fact that I belong to Temple and I brought up my children in Temple, you know, is very different because my family is so Orthodox. And I mean, I rebelled from day one, you know, in many things, many ways.
How do you feel about being Jewish?
I think it's very important to me. But I mean, it's not important to me whether I drive the car or whether I turn on my light on Shabbat, you know. So.
But I mean, the Holocaust in your experiences has
well,
it
I was
affected?
very lucky. The fact that I was very protected during those years, always. You know, but I think that otherwise it probably would have affected me personally a lot more, and much worse.
Well, now that you have told me your story, is there any special message you would like to
Oh my God.
say, or is there anything else that you wanted to bring up?
Such as?
I mean, just, is there anything else you wanted to say about the experience or something you want others to know?
I think everybody ought to know about what happened. Not necessarily to me, but what happened in general. You know, we should not forget it, and our children should know it. But hopefully the next generation will learn from it. For us, it's too late.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Lowenstein.
May I interject here? I was just thinking something that you might want to touch on would be the unification of Germany right now.
Oh.
It's a hot topic.
Thank you, that's a good.
I'm not for
Do you have any
it.
feelings about
No.
German
Yes,
unification?
I don't. I'm not for it. I
How
feel like the Frenchman who said that he feels much more comfortable with two Germanys than with one.
Can you give,
Uh,
elaborate any more on your feelings about it?
Well, I have a feeling that somehow the Prussian attitude is sort of inborn. I might be prejudiced, but I don't like the idea of the Germans becoming that strong again. Because I have a feeling that if they do, they can again cause wars and destruction, whatever. Because, I mean, if you look through history, they've always wanted to conquer and to expand. I mean, the fact that they killed 6 million Jews has really nothing to do with that. They're just because they've started so many other wars too before that. Mm-hmm.
Well,
Well,
I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today.
well, I guess there's nothing else I can add to it.
My grandfather-in-law, he burned the synagogue, and so they got into the car, and at that same moment the Nazis came with axes and whatever, and they took away the suitcase. They said, "Oh, you don't need any clothes anymore," and then they started to hack down the not a door, not a sink, nothing. It was completely demolished on the inside.
Oh, God.
They came to our house with the clothes on their back and everything else.
This was your aunt?
My
Your grand-
grandparents.
And that they didn't stay with you when you came?
They went to Holland with because they had 2 other children in Holland already.
Mm-hmm.
See? And one of my uncles left money for them to live on in Holland. So they had some to live on. And they stayed in Aachen, and on the 1st of, I think it was in September, on Rosh Hashanah in 39, my aunt from Holland called up, "You have to come today. They're closing the borders." And my grandfather, and she carried on so that on Rosh Hashanah day, my grandfather, who had never in his life traveled on Shabbat or holidays, left Germany for...
I wish you'd said that.
You know, those things come later. Of course, it's all
Yeah,
in
it's
my
hard.
tape.
Oh, it's on the other
It's
tape?
all on there. All these things are on there.